In the mid-19th century, Alaska was a vast, icy wilderness that few outsiders dared to explore, let alone understand. Snow-capped mountains rose from thick pine forests, while treacherous coastlines crashed against the Pacific Ocean. For centuries, the indigenous peoples had thrived in this harsh climate. But to outsiders, especially Western empires, Alaska appeared more like a frozen liability than an asset. And yet, buried beneath its glaciers and stretching across its rugged terrain were untapped riches resources that would one day power industries and reshape nations. But back then, few imagined that this frozen land would become one of the most strategic and valuable territories in the world. Russia, which had claimed Alaska in the 18th century, was beginning to feel the weight of its expanding empire. The Crimean War had left the country financially drained and vulnerable. Maintaining a distant outpost like Russian America was costly and logistically impossible to defend, especially from British interests in nearby Canada. Tsar Alexander II saw the writing on the wall. The Russian Empire was faltering, and Alaska had become more of a geopolitical liability than a strength. He needed an exit strategy, a way to offload the territory without losing face or influence. That's when the idea of selling Alaska to the United States quietly emerged in royal chambers. On the American side, the Civil War had just ended. The country was reeling, but its leaders were beginning to look outward again toward expansion and influence. Secretary of State William H. Seward was a fierce believer in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to expand its territory across North America. To him, acquiring Alaska wasn't just about land, it was about positioning America for the future. But when word leaked that the U.S. might actually purchase this icebox, newspapers and politicians erupted in mockery. Seward's Folly, they called it. Seward's iceberg. Why, they wondered, would anyone pay millions for a frozen wasteland? Behind closed doors, however, the deal was already taking shape. Russian envoy Edward de Stuckel had begun private discussions with Seward, proposing terms that seemed almost laughable in hindsight. $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre, for an area twice the size of Texas. But neither man realized just how controversial the purchase would be, or how it would ignite decades of mystery, suspicion, and ultimately vindication. As the ink dried on the secret drafts of the treaty, opponents sharpened their knives and the press prepared its scathing headlines. Little did they know, Alaska would soon reveal its secrets and rewrite American history forever. But what really pushed the deal across the finish line? And what secrets were already known to the men behind the scenes? Secrets that would make this frozen folly one of the most strategic masterstrokes in U.S. history? It was the evening of March 29, 1867, and while most of Washington slept, the doors of the State Department remained unlocked. Inside, Secretary of State William H. Seward sat with his Russian counterpart, Baron Edward de Stuckel. A bottle of wine sat half-drunk on the table, their voices low, the atmosphere tense. For weeks, they had danced around numbers, terms, and timing. Russia was eager to sell, America uncertain but tempted. That night, in the quiet hours before dawn, a deal was struck. The United States would purchase Alaska for $7.2 million, roughly $140 million in today's money. It was one of the largest land acquisitions in U.S. history, and it happened while most Americans were sound asleep. When the news broke the next morning, outrage swept through Congress and the press. Lawmakers derided it as a wasteful purchase. An icebox for polar bears, they scoffed. Newspapers mocked Seward, calling the acquisition everything from Seward's Folly to Russia's cast-off. Few understood the strategic vision. What good, after all, was a frozen wilderness 3,000 miles from the capital? The criticism was so loud that President Andrew Johnson barely lifted a finger to defend it. But Seward remained undeterred. He believed Alaska was not a folly, but a foothold. One day, he predicted, this barren land would yield gold, oil, and influence that no one could yet imagine. Behind Seward's optimism were whispers. Rumors passed between diplomats, traders, and military men. Stories of thick forests teeming with fur-bearing animals, of uncut timber and fertile fishing grounds. Russia, too, had suspicions, perhaps even knowledge of Alaska's true value, but geopolitical exhaustion and fear of British expansion made them act. Better to sell the territory to a future friend than risk losing it to a rival. And while American politicians debated and journalists sneered, the Senate quietly ratified the treaty by a narrow margin. The check was written, the deal done, and with the stroke of a pen, the United States added 586,000 square miles of land to its territory. Yet, despite the official signing, Alaska remained in limbo. Months would pass before the U.S. military would officially take possession of the land. And when they did, on a gray October morning in Sitka, the moment was eerily subdued. A small crowd gathered. The Russian flag was lowered, the American flag raised. Cannons fired from ships in the harbor. But beyond the ceremonial spectacle, few truly grasped the gravity of what had just occurred. A sleeping giant had entered America's fold, one whose riches, power, and controversy would ripple through centuries. But as the stars and stripes fluttered in the Alaskan wind, few could predict what lay beneath the ice, what hidden treasures would soon be uncovered, and who would fight to control them. For more than 2 decades after the purchase, Alaska remained a quiet outpost, a vast frozen frontier with little purpose in the eyes of most Americans. Settlers were scarce, trade minimal, and the land itself seemed stubbornly silent. But then, in the summer of 1896, a faint whisper from the Yukon River would thunder across the continent. Gold. When prospectors stumbled upon shimmering flecks of the precious metal in a tributary called Bonanza Creek, everything changed. Within months, thousands flooded north in what became known as the Klondike Gold Rush. Tent cities sprang up overnight. Rivers of men in battered boots and frozen fingers braved death for a shot at fortune. Alaska, once mocked, was now seen as the new El Dorado. Gold fever gripped the nation, but that was only the beginning. The real awakening came in the early 20th century, not from mountain streams but deep beneath the tundra. Oil. In 1923, President Harding designated vast tracts of Alaskan land as a naval petroleum reserve. Exploratory wells followed. Then, in 1968, the Prudhoe Bay oil field was discovered, one of the largest in North America. Suddenly, Alaska wasn't just rich, it was a crown jewel in America's energy empire. Plans for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System took shape, and soon a river of black gold flowed southward, fueling American homes and ambitions. But wealth, as always, came with conflict. The gold rush displaced native communities, rupturing ancient cultures and traditions. The discovery of oil sparked fierce debates over land rights, conservation, and sovereignty. Indigenous Alaskans, Inuit, Aleut, Tlingit, fought for recognition and justice. Their voices, once ignored, now echoed through courtrooms and Congress. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 marked a turning point, granting 44 million acres of land and nearly $1 billion in compensation. It was a landmark victory, but also a reminder that prosperity often demands a reckoning. As Alaska's fortunes grew, so did its strategic importance. The Cold War thrust it into the center of global power dynamics. Its proximity to the Soviet Union made it a linchpin in America's defense network. Missile silos, radar installations, and Air Force bases sprouted across the icy landscape. Alaska was no longer the forgotten land, it was a buffer, a sentinel, a fortress. From gold to oil to geopolitics, the land once dubbed Seward's Folly had become a foundation of American strength. And yet, behind the progress, darker truths loomed. Questions about exploitation, environmental damage, and political manipulation. As America's grip on Alaska tightened, so did the consequences. What secrets had been buried beneath the profits? And what hidden motives shaped the original deal? The U.S. had struck what many now saw as the deal of the century, but few asked why Russia was so eager to part with such a vast and resource-rich land. At face value, the reason was simple. The Russian Empire was strapped for cash. The Crimean War had drained its treasury, and maintaining its Alaskan colony, so distant, so isolated, was both logistically and financially taxing. But beneath the official narrative, there were whispers of deeper motives. Russia feared losing Alaska to the British in a future conflict. By selling it to the United States, they not only rid themselves of a liability, they also strengthened a potential ally against Britain, their imperial rival. Some historians argue the sale was less about Alaska's value and more about geopolitics. Russia wanted a stronger America, an America that could check British power on the continent. The Tsar's advisors even believed that fostering goodwill with the United States would pay dividends down the road. And it did. In the decades that followed, the two nations, though ideologically different, maintained a curious diplomatic détente until the tensions of the Cold War shattered that uneasy balance. But back in 1867, Russia was playing a long game. Alaska, in their eyes, was a pawn in a much larger imperial chessboard. There's another theory, one that veers into conspiracy and intrigue. Some suggest the sale wasn't entirely above board, that secret lobbying, backroom negotiations, and even personal favors were exchanged to push the deal through. After all, $7.2 million in 1867 was an enormous sum to move quietly. Critics at the time asked, who profited, who signed off the checks, and where exactly did the money go? Was it truly about national interest or about individual enrichment? There were no public hearings, no congressional transparency, just a handshake and a transfer of land that would eventually become worth trillions. Then came the aftermath. The U.S. government didn't rush to settle or develop the new territory. It was almost as if the acquisition was symbolic more of a placeholder than a planned investment. For years, Alaska was governed with minimal oversight. No infrastructure, no representation, no serious integration into the Union. Some theorists suggest that the U.S. didn't realize what it had bought, that even Seward himself couldn't have imagined the vast wealth buried beneath the permafrost. But perhaps someone did. Perhaps this folly was never a mistake, but a masterstroke hidden behind a smokescreen of ridicule and doubt. As the 20th century dawned, Alaska would become more than just an economic prize. It would emerge as a strategic keystone in America's global ascent. But how exactly did this frozen frontier help shape America's destiny on the world stage? As the decades rolled on, the true value of Alaska began to reveal itself not just in its mineral wealth, but in its unmatched strategic significance. During World War II, Alaska was no longer a forgotten outpost. It became a critical military staging ground. The Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands in 1942 marked the first time enemy forces occupied U.S. territory since the War of 1812. Suddenly, Alaska was thrust into the heart of America's defense strategy. The once ridiculed purchase had become a lifeline. Air bases were built, troops deployed, and radars erected, turning Alaska into a frontline fortress against foreign aggression. And then came the Cold War. With the Soviet Union now looming just across the Bering Strait, Alaska's location became priceless. The U.S. established a dense web of military installations, radar stations, and nuclear detection systems across its Arctic reaches. The infamous Due Line Distant Early Warning ran right through Alaska, serving as the country's eyes against incoming Soviet missiles. Had the Cold War ever gone hot, Alaska would have likely been ground zero. Suddenly, what had once been called a barren wasteland was the front porch of America's survival strategy. But it wasn't just about defense. Alaska turned out to be a treasure chest. Gold had been discovered in the late 1800s, triggering rushes that brought settlers and money into the region. In 1968, one of the largest oil fields in North America was discovered in Prudhoe Bay. The Alaska pipeline followed soon after, pumping billions of barrels of crude oil southward. The state's wealth transformed overnight. From fisheries to timber, minerals to tourism, Alaska became a multi-billion-dollar engine for the American economy. A land once deemed worthless now glistened with prosperity, and its strategic importance was matched only by its resource potential. By the time Alaska became the 49th state in 1959, the narrative had shifted. What had started as Seward's Folly was now considered one of the greatest land deals in modern history. Russia's loss was America's gain exponentially, and the echoes of that 1867 handshake still resonate today. From energy policy to military dominance, environmental battles to indigenous sovereignty, Alaska continues to shape America's future. And yet, the story behind its purchase, how it was ridiculed, misunderstood, and almost forgotten, serves as a powerful reminder. Sometimes, history's most transformative moments come wrapped in mockery and doubt, until the ice melts and the gold shines through. So, the next time someone calls a bold decision a folly, remember Alaska, a frozen wilderness that turned out to be a crown jewel, quietly anchoring the rise of an American superpower. Thank you for joining this journey through history, mystery, and the stars. If you want to uncover more untold stories from history, hit subscribe and stay tuned.